Nou, beste mensen, allemaal van harte welkom op deze 111ste Radboud Grand Round. Fijn dat jullie allemaal gekomen zijn, ondanks het mooie weer. En fijn dat u allemaal online aanwezig bent thuis of op het werk. Of in de zon natuurlijk met het prachtige zomerweer. En dat, u bent niet voor niks gekomen. We hebben een hele bijzondere spreker die ik zo zal inleiden. Ik wijs nog heel even op de mogelijkheid voor de mensen die online aanwezig zijn dat u vragen kunt stellen in de chat. Marjolein zit daar, die zal alle vragen zien. En op een iPad die ik dadelijk dan krijg bij het leiden van de discussie, dan kan ik de vragen live zien komen. En dus ga uw gang en zorg voor een interactieve meeting. En dat geldt natuurlijk ook voor u hier aanwezig in de zaal. Yeah, I switched to English. Yoav, it's great to have you here. You are epidemiologist in Bristol and a professor in epidemiology. You're also a consultant in public health. And you will tell us more about life course epidemiology and what that does mean for the understanding of disease and chronic diseases and aging as well. So the floor is on you. We have 30 minutes time for your presentation and we'll then go on with an interactive part of this session. A warm hand for Yoav.
Thank you very much, Jan. Let's see. Okay, and first of all, my thanks to Bas Blum, who will be coming. He sent his apologies. He will be a bit late, but he's coming. And lovely to see so many people from the Parkinson's Clinical Excellence Unit. And of course, Radboud University, who gave me an Excellence Award, which has obviously allowed me to spend time. This is my last 2-month visit here at Radboud University, and I've really enjoyed being at the university and really enjoyed being in Nijmegen and all the wonderful cycle lanes. Okay, so I'm going to assume that most of you probably know very little or nothing about life course epidemiology. So I'm going to start right at the beginning. I'm going to explain what I mean, give you some definitions, but more importantly, elucidate some of the models that myself, my colleague Daiku has proposed and other people have tried to test, including ourselves in various ways, briefly discuss some of the methodological challenges, but then perhaps more importantly, I'm going to try and illustrate some of the concepts and principles within the area of prevention. As Jan said, I'm a public health doctor. I don't see patients on the wards anymore, so I tend to have the luxury of looking at the bigger picture. How can we change society, communities to prevent disease rather than just treat them once they've already got disease? But I will talk a little bit about the clinical aspects. And because of my interest is in neurodegenerative diseases and aging, as I get older myself, I become more and more interested in aging. Some of my examples are related to that field of research. So start at the beginning. I've been working in this area now for over 20 years. And myself and Diana Koo, who very importantly used to run one of the best life course studies called the 1946 birth cohort. I'll show some data from that further on. We got very interested in this whole area at the time when another theory or model disease was being developed. It was called, now it's called DOHAD. It used to be called the fetal origins of health and disease. Now it's called the developmental origins. And we actually tried to put together existing models. So at the time when I was starting off, there were these fetal origins model. There was what's commonly called as the adult lifestyle model, things like how smoking or blood pressure affects chronic diseases. And there's been a long history in epidemiology and public health of what we call the social epidemiological model, how where you fit in society, whether it's based on your educational level or your wealth, how that impacts your risk of getting future disease. And it seemed to us that actually you could bring these all together by looking at what we call life course epidemiology. So this was studying the long-term effects of things that happen to you both in your mother's womb, as a child, as an adult, and later on in life. And importantly, we didn't want to dichotomize or differentiate between sort of biological theories of health versus behavioral theories versus psychosocial theories and so on. So we tried to bring them together under this broad umbrella term of life course epidemiology. Is that the right? Oh, that one? Which is the pointer? The one that does the little circle. Is it that one? Oh, it's not working? Oh, we showed it earlier. Okay, anyway, you can see at the bottom of the slide, there are various books that have been produced by Oxford University Press that we've been involved in. The one on the left was the first one we did, and then I was also involved in the Healthy Aging book. So, what's life course epidemiology? When I'm at a party and someone says, well, what do you do for your research? And I start to explain to them, people look at me like I'm an idiot, say, well, it's obvious, isn't it? What happens to you in your life? Of course, it's all going to be important. And of course, they're right. But it's like saying all disease is a function of genes and environment. Might be true, but so what? How does that actually help us understand and, more importantly, prevent diseases? And what I like, this is a quote, I really like it very much. It says, all models are wrong. The practical question is, how wrong do they have to be not to be useful? Okay? So we as humans, we simplify the world. And what I'm going to show you are very simple models, but if they help us understand how the world works and, more importantly, how we can change it, they can be useful. On the right, this is it's called the ecosocial model of health inequalities, put forward by Margaret Whitehead and Goran Dahlgren. And it simply shows how people are embedded and their lifestyles are embedded within social communities, which are then embedded with areas and countries and policies and so on, and how generic cultural socioeconomic factors can influence individual lives. So that's one model, but we put forward some different models. So these we call them theoretical models because depending on the disease you're studying, these may or may not be true. And so what we want people to do is think about them and either with evidence support them or refute them. So essentially, there are two classes of models. The first one we call critical or sensitive period models, and there can be interactions with later things in life, or what we call effect modifiers in epidemiology. And the second class of models are called accumulation of risk, how things accumulate over your life course, ultimately resulting in ill health and disease. And I'm just going to illustrate some of these. So the first one, the gentleman on the left, he's passed away now. His name is Professor David Barker. He was actually on the interview panel for my Wellcome Trust Fellowship that started my career in epidemiology. And he at the time, this is in the late 1980s, was developing a model that argued what happens to you or your mother, at the top you see maternal body composition, could affect how the fetus grows and develops. And of course, all our bodily structures, our physiology are all happening in fetal life. So they can alter your liver, they could alter the structure of your heart, your blood vessels, they could alter the hormones. HPA is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, GH is growth hormone, IGF. They could alter your muscle, your pancreas, all of which could in later life result in diabetes, hypertension, enlargement of the heart, abnormalities of your cholesterol, fibrinogen, ultimately resulting in why some people maybe get a heart attack in their 60s as opposed to 70s and 80s. And in fact, this was a book he published at the time called The Fetal and Infant Origins of Adult Disease. When he first came up with these ideas, most people actually laughed. That particularly in America, he had a very hard time getting his ideas taken seriously. And I'll show you some data in a minute, but there's a lot of evidence for some things that support that. Similarly, so if you think about early life, you can think about exposures in early life either as being critical, okay? In other words, if you're exposed to that thing in early life, it has a permanent long-term effect. And if you're exposed outside of that critical time window, nothing happens. So a classic example would be women who unfortunately took thalidomide during pregnancy because they had morning sickness, and some of their kids developed limb abnormalities. Classically in ethology, Konrad Lorenz with imprinting. Or there could be something which is known as a sensitive period effect, so that you still get an effect outside of that time window, but the body is more sensitive to either good or bad effects of the exposure. So classically, clinically, children who are exposed to certain infectious disease in young life tend to get fewer complications than if they have the same infectious disease in later life. So that would be a sensitive period exposure model. Okay, so yeah, so this I just wanted to show you this, a meta-analysis of over 7 million people from 135 studies. If you have a look at the x-axis, the authors have plotted the birth weight of babies. Birth weight's not a very good exposure, but it's easy to measure, and we have it in lots of studies. And what you can see on the y-axis is the risk of 3 different diseases: type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or hypertension. And for 2 of them, there's a sort of U or J, inverted J shape. So actually the highest risk is in the smallest babies, but there's also an increased risk for heavier babies, possibly due to gestational diabetes. But for birth weight and hypertension, it's almost inversely linear. The greater the risk of hypertension, the smaller the baby, okay? So whatever's going on, and these studies have adjusted for smoking, for things that happen in adult life, and they still observe these associations. So something's going on in fetal life that has a long-term effect. Okay, so the second type of models, as I said, are accumulation models. And this is a picture we did from one of our papers. So we tried to just show these very simply in visual images. So if you take the first one, model A, you have 3 exposures, A, B, C. Each one of those, if you are someone exposed to A, B, and C, you have a greater risk of disease than if you only have A and B, which is worse than just having A. But you can see the boxes are not connected. So essentially it's random. If I get A, I may or may not get B or C. It's totally random. If, however, you go on to model B, we call that the risk clustering model. Here, you can see that if you have D, and for sake of argument, D could be something like growing in a poor home in your childhood, you're more likely to be exposed to A, say, passive smoke exposure, B, say, overcrowding, C, maybe an unhealthy diet. And each one of those themselves increase your risk of, say, later heart disease. And then you have model C, which is what we call an additive chain of risk, as opposed to model D, which is called a trigger chain of risk. The difference between model C and D, as you can see from the diagram, in D, if you don't get to C, nothing bad happens. But in C, if you still have A and B, that's not as good. But obviously all 3 of them are the worst. Okay, so these are different theoretical models. And if I just give you a hypothetical example, so there's some evidence that suggests that hearing loss is a predictor of later life cognitive decline dementia. Now, there's some debate about whether hearing loss itself could be a prodrome of dementia, but let's assume it isn't. Well, one possibility is that hearing loss leads people to be socially isolated. And if you're socially isolated, you get less cognitive stimulation. And maybe it's the cognitive stimulation or the less cognitive stimulation that leads to cognitive decline and dementia. Now, this is all hypothetical. If that's true, then all we have to do is alleviate the lack of cognitive stimulation, and we have no effect of hearing loss. If, on the other hand, model C is true, then even with cognitive stimulation, there will still be additional adverse effects of hearing loss and social isolation. So actually knowing which of those models is true has got some practical value. Okay, so the other thing that I like a lot about thinking within a life course approach is it makes you think about this diagram. So this, again, is a hypothetical diagram. Depending on what your disease of interest is, we're assuming that below a certain level of function, you start to get symptoms. And when you start to get symptoms, you go and see a doctor, and you may be labeled as having a disease. So, for example, we could be looking at respiratory function or shortness of breath because you have underlying chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We could be looking at cognitive function, which, when bad enough, means you can't do your day-to-day activities and you get diagnosed with dementia. We could be looking at something like osteoporosis, which, when severe enough, is likely to be associated with fractured neck of femur. And if you think about this in developmental terms, there's an initial period in early life where things acting at that point could be important in terms of critical and sensitive period, reaching a plateau phase, and then a senescence or decline level in later life, okay? Now, what I like to think about, imagine we've got 4 lines there, A, B, C, D. You can either think of these as 4 individuals or patients, or you can think of these as 4 populations. So A is the best. They get to be 100 years of age, and they have no symptoms. They're leading a very healthy life. That's what we're all trying to reach. If you take, though, B, C, and D, they all at some point in their 80s or 90s get clinical disease. In my example, D gets it much earlier in life. And phenotypically, they may look the same. To a doctor, they may have the same symptoms and complaints. But the important thing is how they got there will be very different, which means how you could prevent them will be different. And also, when you look at risk factors for the disease, you'll get different estimates depending on whether you're following pathway B or pathway C and D. Okay? So the beauty of it is, if you only look at later life and you only have functional measures in later life, you're not going to understand how people have got to where they've got to unless you've got life course or longitudinal repeat measures. And then you can start to unpick the different pathways and try and understand what's driving those pathways. So here's an example. This is using a very simple measure, which as an epidemiologist I love because it's cheap, it's acceptable to patients, and actually it's a fantastic predictor. This is simply asking people to squeeze something called the dynamometer, which measures your grip strength. So the stronger you squeeze, the stronger your grip strength. And we know from lots of other studies, people with stronger grip strengths are less likely to die, less likely to be hospitalized, less likely to get dementia. It's a fantastic, simple, cheap measure of a sort of frailty concept, okay? So what you can see in this graph, there are actually 5 different lines. They're from 5 different cohorts of people. So people, the last group is looking at people in their 40s, or they recruit in their 40s, and then you can see the statistical model has modeled this decline. Then the next one above are people recruited a bit earlier, and then the final group were people recruited in their 20s, so they are still in their upward trajectory. And for grip strength, in this study, I think this is from Sweden, every cohort is a bit stronger than the previous cohort. So you're getting what's called a cohort effect. So if you take people in their 40s, people born more recently are stronger than people born 20, 30 years earlier, which, if my prediction is correct, means they will be less frail if we follow them up in 30, 40 years' time. So this is really nice because it shows you the trajectory. It's the same for men and women. Over time, men obviously have slightly stronger grip strength than women. So that was the trajectory of the outcome of interest, grip strength. But you can also look at the trajectory of exposures. And this is a really nice paper from the Whitehall 2 study. It's a big study of UK civil servants, followed up now for a very long time. What you have here is the red line, and the squares are people who've gone on to develop dementia, just over 300, and the blue or diamonds are about 2,000 people who haven't got dementia. And as you can see, they've taken the diagnosis as time being 0, so we've gone back in time, and they've got all these repeat measures of their body mass index. Now, why this is really interesting is about 4 or 5 years ago, put on the BBC News, latest research shows being fat means you have less dementia. And everyone goes, whoa, that's not what we expected. Fat's always bad, isn't it? Being obese is always bad for you. How come? And this was from a very large routine general practice database where they only had follow-up for about 10 years, okay? What you can actually see is that people who go on to get dementia actually start to lose weight, but about 10 years before, well before they're diagnosed. So if you measure their body mass index 4 years before diagnosis, they will be lighter. So hence, lightness appears to be, they'll be lighter, that's right. So being heavy appears to be protective, okay? Now, if you have this picture, you can see why this is known as reverse causation. It's not that obesity protects you from dementia, it's that people who go on to get dementia will lose weight prior to their dementing illness. So another really useful thing about looking at trajectories. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about prevention. So you've seen this picture before. In public health, we talk about 3 types of prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, okay? So I'm going to focus mainly on primary and secondary. If people in the lower graph, in the lower line, if I could shove them up by some intervention, and technically we talk about enhancing reserve, I could delay the age at which point they get their disease, or maybe they'll never get their disease. So that's one area. Similarly, if they're at the plateau phase, if I can delay when they start to go downhill, again, I will delay disease onset, or they may never get disease. Finally, the bit that we tend to do clinically is once they already have disease, if we can slow down the rate of progression using disease-modifying therapies, that will be great. Either they'll have slower progression, less likely to die, or we can reduce disability, improve quality of life. So in terms of Alzheimer's disease, this is a review done a few years back by Carol Brain and the group in Cambridge. And you can see in terms of what they call the population attributable risk percent, how much of the disease could we abolish if we could intervene here? I've highlighted 2. In fact, the biggest one was low educational attainment at about 20%. But I'm also going to talk about hypertension because I think hypertension is really interesting. Weaker, but still really important. So why low education? So this is a meta-analysis each one of these studies, there's one funny outlier, which you can see, which has got the result in the wrong way round, but almost every study shows the lower your educational attainment, however you measure it, the greater the risk. So this is in childhood or young adulthood, the greater your risk of getting dementia. Very consistent. But what's behind that association? So I have to very briefly talk about something called Mendelian randomization, which some of you may be familiar. This is a methodology that George Davies Smith, who's my professor colleague at Bristol at the MRC IEU, really put on the map. What he did, he came up with the very sensible insight that we are all products of a randomized controlled trial. That's because the genes from our mother and father were randomly mixed to create me as opposed to my sister, who shares 50% of my DNA, but essentially we are all randomized mixtures of genes. And unlike normally, when we do observational study and we find that something, an exposure is linked to an outcome, we can never be sure, unless it's randomized through a trial, whether that's due to something called confounding or reverse causation. But if you can use a genetic instrument, i.e. a series of SNPs that predict the exposure, those SNPs were given to you at birth, so they can't be due to reverse causation. You've had them all your life. And they shouldn't. There are a whole load of assumptions. If you can show those SNPs only predict the exposure, nothing else, they can't be due to confounding. So one way of looking at that question I showed you before is you can take a whole bunch of SNPs from GWASs and say, well, what SNPs predict IQ or cognitive performance? And what SNPs predict your educational attainment? Now, surprisingly, there isn't that much overlap. When I first thought about this, oh, well, aren't they going to be the same? Doesn't your intelligence predict your educational attainment? But out of 150, 180 SNPs, there were only 10 that predicted both. So you can remove those. And in this study, we're not looking at how many years of schooling people had. We're looking at whether they had the genes that predicted more schooling or the genes that predicted more IQ. And what you can see when you do the simple, what we call the univariable analysis, both predicted. So if you had the genes for more schooling or the genes for more IQ, you were less likely to get dementia. So if you do a big case control study, you'll find that association. When we put them in together in a multivariable model, so that's now the blue dots, you can see that the IQ SNPs still predicted, they were still protective, but the schooling now no longer predicted. So the question is it really how many years of school, or is it your intelligence that's protecting you from future dementia? However, there's another lovely bit of evidence for this, and that's using what we call natural experiments. Okay, so we're not randomizing people, but this is, again, from a meta-analysis. Over the years, different countries and states, particularly within America, have altered the compulsory age at which people can leave school. There was a time when you could leave school at 15 or 16 or 17 or 18. And they can use that natural experiment. So if you look at people who had to go to school before the compulsory age was raised and after, you can compare their IQ and see is there any difference on the assumption that nothing else would have changed except the policy. And what you can see here is that kids who had to stay at school for longer, on average, had about 2.3 IQ points more. They performed better on IQ tests. Now, you might say, well, so what? 2.3 IQ points? That's not a lot. What does that mean? But in this really nice study from the Health Retirement Study, Maria Gleimore and colleagues looked at the same question, but they now looked at dementia outcomes because these are much older people. And what they found using what we call an instrumental variable analysis, that if you take people who just happen to live in one state or the other, those for every additional year of schooling, there was almost a 10% reduction in the risk of dementia, suggesting this is modifiable and it's not just due to confounding. And again, really interesting if it's true, and many countries in the world where you could implement this. So that was enhancing reserve. What about delaying decline? That's the next bit of the big red arrow. So if we're going to delay decline, the first question you have to ask is, when does decline begin? Okay, I said to you there's a plateau phase. And for cognition, we don't actually have that much great data. This, again, comes from the Whitehall 2 study. You can see they've got people measured at 45 to 49, 50 to 54, so on up to 65 to 70. And they have a whole battery of cognitive tests. So what you're seeing here is the change as people get older. This is longitudinal data, okay? So interestingly and unsurprisingly, our vocabulary performance, my ability to understand language or use sophisticated language, doesn't decline very much as I get older. But my test of reasoning, like inductive reasoning, looking at patterns in numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, what's the next number? You can see that shows quite a marked % decline as I get older. And of course, they only started at 45. What if they'd had people aged 20, 30, 40? I suspect the decline for some people starts even sooner. So you can see, well before we ever get clinical disease, there's evidence that unfortunately, our cognition is going down. I should say that's on average. That's not to say within people, some people's cognition doesn't decline. So, okay, so I said about hypertension. So I find really interesting, this is from the famous Framingham Heart Study, one of the famous epidemiological studies. This is looking at people who developed hypertension at various ages, as opposed to they still haven't got hypertension. And what you can see, these are models of their blood, so they've got repeat blood pressure measures. These are trajectories of blood pressure. So unsurprisingly, if you get hypertension at 40 to 49, you start to get a marked elevation in your blood pressure around 35 to 40, and so on and so on. I call these turning points. So the really interesting question is, why do some people never show an increase and some show a marked increase? Why do some people get it in their 30s, some in their 40s, some in their 50s? Was this driven by genetic predisposition, or is it driven by salt in diet, obesity, environmental factors? And if it's the latter, then can we delay? You may always get hypertension because you've got the genes, but if you get hypertension, as I'll show you in a minute, in your 70s, that's much better than getting it in your 50s. And this is the reason why. So this is a lovely paper. This is using 2 different American cohorts. They took people who have normal blood pressure, i.e. 120/80, but as you can see on the left, the black are people who've always had very low, or normal blood pressure, I should say, but the white circles and triangles are people who had slightly elevated, who were then treated, and that's why they're now normotensive. So you can see on the left, the area under the curve, the exposure of their blood vessels, their kidneys, their eyes, their brains are very different. And if you then compare what happens to these people, so these are all people who currently have a blood pressure of 120/80, which is excellent, normal. You've got the untreated group versus the treated, well-controlled, and whether you have CVD, CHD, heart failure, stroke, you've got a doubling, almost more than doubling of risk, even if you're normotensive, because historically you've had this longer history of hypertension. Or not even hypertension, higher blood pressure, because these blood pressures are not things that we would treat pharmacologically because they don't fulfill current guidance. So what does this do to the brain? So this is, I mentioned the 1946 birth cohort. So within that, they have a little sub-study called Insight 46, led by Nick Fox and Jonathan Schott at the Institute of Neurology. And they've done some really clever imaging, MRI and so on. So this is just looking at whole brain volume. So this is when people are, because they're all a birth cohort, they're all the same age, they're all about 70. But they've got pressure readings at 36, 43, 53, 60, 64, and 69. And what's fascinating is, unsurprisingly, high blood pressure bad for your brain volume or shrinkage, but actually the strongest effect, if you just look at the coefficients, is your blood pressure at 43. At 43, only 2% of the cohort were being treated for hypertension because most of them were not hypertensive. But for a 10 millimeter increase in blood pressure, those people have smaller brains at 69, 70. So that raises the important question. And I'm not suggesting we should be pharmacologically treating these people. What I'm saying is if we could shift the blood pressure distribution at a much younger age, we would see the benefits 20, 30 years later. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about why is it decline is not inevitable? What determines what I call the other side of the equation? So we have this little line that says, oh, as we get to be 30, 40, 50, everything's going downhill. But actually that's not true. The human body is incredibly capable of reversing damage. And I've divided this into what I call intrinsic compensation, which is more biologically driven, as opposed to adaptation or extrinsic things that you can do to help you cope with any potential decline. So we've already talked about structural reserve, like the educational attainment. There is compensatory reserve. Okay, so for example, if you happen to have one of your kidneys removed, we know you'll get renal hypertrophy. The remaining kidney, it won't be able to sustain the same level of kidney function, but it will compensate to some degree. So in fact, it'll look like you've got 1.5 kidneys rather than 1 kidney. Okay? After a stroke or a heart attack, to what degree do the circulatory system adapt so you have less dysfunction? Unfortunately, some of that declines as you get older. The other things are how you, in terms of your psychological well-being or your social cultural factors, cope with decline. And famous developmental psychologist Paul Baltes in Germany wrote a whole lot about what he called about optimization and compensation, how we as human beings compensate when things start to go downhill. So actually there's remarkably little written about this. I started to search recently. This is one paper around stroke recovery. So why is it some people make good recovery or not? Now, obviously, some of that is determined by how bad was the stroke, how much cerebral damage is it. But, as they point out in this paper, some of it could be due to your cognitive reserve, how much connectivity you had beforehand, or it could be due to personality factors that could modify that. And a nice example of this is from the South London Stroke Register, where they're not looking at deaths, they're simply looking at how much disability or functional impairment there is after a stroke, and they've classified whether people come from sort of the most affluent 25% down to the most poorest 25%. And as you can see, your poverty, and almost certainly they didn't have this, but your life course poverty will predict how well you recover after your stroke. So in the last few minutes, we all now live in the world of omics. This is a quote published in the New England Journal of Medicine from Francis Collins and Harold Varmus about how we have to have these amazing data sets with lots of biological samples, etc., etc. However, it wouldn't be hard to enlarge that vision to include life course data, either through digitals or through record linkage and so on, that allow you not only to measure people's biology, their genetics, their omics, their proteomics, but other life course exposures, and then put that all together. And I would argue that would actually help us do a better job in terms of diagnosis, etiology, and prognosis. So just to summarize, I may or may not have convinced you, but I hope I have, that if you take a life course approach, you will actually get a broader vision. I'm not saying that all diseases have life course influences. I'm just saying that we should be agnostic and think about them. And more importantly, we should try and understand phenotypic heterogeneity in terms of how people get to be where they are through their life course trajectories, and look at exposures acting at critical sensitive periods or at chains of risk. Obviously, there are lots of challenges to do that. The biggest challenge usually is the data. Having the data, you can't test the hypothesis if there's no data. And sometimes what we have to do is we call this I call this jigsaw epidemiology. There is no one data set that has everything you need. So you have to take bits of the puzzle from different data sets and try and triangulate them in a jigsaw. But ultimately, I think this will better guide prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Thank you very much.
Yoav, thank you very much for your interesting talk about life course epidemiology. And I'm very glad that you mentioned also Barker as a gynecologist, grew up here in Nijmegen.
Okay, yes.
I grew up with the Barker hypothesis. Yeah. And actually Erik Stekers, he's a famous obstetrician in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And he focused also social economic interventions as part of his daily practice as a gynecologist, right. Inspired by Barker. So right. I'm glad that you mentioned his name. And talking about interventions, I grew, as a doctor, I like to intervene. And only the last bullet is about intervention. And do you think that life course epidemiology makes it not a little bit too difficult? And one of the most simple interventions that we have to fight for is the fight against poverty in our society, because that's a major determinant of disease and chronic disease. What do you think about that?
Well, as I'm someone who's affiliated to public health medicine, you will not be surprised to know I strongly agree with you. I mean, without doubt, poverty, adverse socioeconomic conditions is a major predictor for many, many outcomes. Now, the question from a policymaker's point of view, do you try and understand what's driving, what is the mechanism between poverty and the disease, and intervene in the intermediary. So if you think, oh, it's all because poor people just smoke more, smoking causes disease, so we just got to stop them smoking, then you target that. On the other hand, if you think more upstream, you say, well, it doesn't matter. If we can abolish poverty, maybe all the other things will disappear. So I think the problem then is, this is where politics come in, depending on the political party. So for example, at the moment, the current British government would focus on the downstream determinants because that's how they view, and they would argue, no, it's too hard to abolish poverty, or they believe in the trickle-down effect. If we make the rich richer, we all become richer, which actually doesn't happen. But as you'd expect, I have a strong belief that if you can intervene and reduce social inequalities, you will have many benefits on many health outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Katrien Grunberg, pathologist.
So I was thinking about your graph showing the weight loss in people who... sorry.
Yeah.
People who had weight loss before their diagnosis of Alzheimer, but the lines cross, and at the early phase of the looking back of the history, it seemed to me that the Alzheimer people had a higher weight. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And do you have an explanation for that?
Yeah. So the current view is that midlife adiposity, or adiposity in earlier life, has all the negative cardiometabolic effects, insulin resistance, hypertension, which themselves increase either vascular dementia or vascular pathology in line with Alzheimer dementia. So yes, that it could so what we're saying is that the influence depends on the risk factor where it is in life. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, Bas Bloem.
Wait, you have to have the box.
I've been asked a lot about population attributable risk for Parkinson's. How much is smoking? How much is pesticides? How much is air pollution? Hearing your talk about reverse causation, lag times, chain of events, should we bin the whole idea and just say this is all illusionary and it's just too difficult to make any conclusions? Because there are these papers where people say, oh, Alzheimer's is 5.1% is hypertension. And what do you think?
So as you can tell, I am skeptical about some of those estimates. I totally understand why people want to do them and why policymakers, because they want to know, where should we invest our money? Do we get more bang per buck if we focus on X or Y? But I think you have to treat those numbers with great caution. So the hearing loss, in fact, I published a paper showing hearing loss predicts dementia, okay? And the Lancet Dementia Commission said, oh, we need to intervene. We need to do randomized trials to reduce hearing loss. But it could all be reverse causation. I don't know, because the gap between hearing loss measure, the audiometry, and disease wasn't long enough. Okay, they may do the trials may come out totally negative. It would help the hearing. I'm not against, we should be improving people's hearing, but it may not prevent those people getting dementia. So I think you have to be very cautious, and I suspect quite a lot of those numbers are actually wrong.
I'd be very cautious, but does that mean that it's quite a problem to help decision makers to guide their interventions? Is the bridge not possible?
It's okay. So one of the problems with life course epidemiology.
If you only answer with question marks, nothing happens.
You're right. Or what happens is they pick and choose what they believe in, and that's what they support. So of course, one of the problems is no one's going to do an RCT where they randomize children at 5 and they wait 60 years for the outcome. It's not going to happen. It's probably ethical, but no one's going to fund it. So what you have to do is you have to do simulations and put together the best evidence in different bits of the model, and then say, we think. And ideally, if you then have natural experiments, you can then test it within a natural experiment setting. But it's very difficult. I teach medical students in Bristol, and one of my favorite examples, so we all know being fat and not doing exercise is bad for you. Actually quite hard to demonstrate that. My favorite example is the American embargo of Cuba in 1985 to 89, where basically the Cuban government couldn't import petrol, couldn't import fast food. They gave out 1 million free bicycles, the population will cycle. Weight, BMI plummeted. Diabetes, type 2 plummeted. Heart disease, and then of course after the embargo lifted, rebound effect, they all put on weight. At the end they were heavier than they were before. And that's a wonderful natural experiment. It works, but not that we can do that in the real world. We have to do it in a different way.
And do you make a plea for that every policy measure should be followed by evaluation, by proper analysis of whether it worked or not?
So again, as a public health doctor, we often can't do an RCT as in a drug RCT where you double, but it's impossible. But what you can do really clever interrupted time. You can do clever observational data as long as you have a population. You don't intervene everybody overnight. You either randomize it or you have a counterfactual population who you can observe for a period to see what has been the benefit of the intervention. So I do think governments often don't want to evaluate because it might show they were wrong, but we could evaluate things that policymakers do, and we should. And that's where places like Europe is fantastic because different European countries have different policies. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah. Please use the microphone and state your name.
Hi, I'm Jules. Thanks very much, Yoav. Is this a lesson for public health experts, policymakers, or is there something to be learned for individual doctors or even individual patients?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think both. I think from a person's point of view, so interestingly, when David Barker, his ideas first permeated, there was a lot of negativity. And part of the negativity was they felt that your health was predestined. Oh, I was born a small baby. I'm going to get heart disease. Oh, there's nothing we can do about it, which is not a nice thing to think about as a person, and actually isn't true. Because we know that actually, for example, one of the early studies showed that babies who were small, who put on weight in later life, had the highest risk of heart disease. And if they didn't become obese in later life, then being smaller baby wasn't that bad. It was a slight increased risk. So I think from a public point of view, I think it's really important to show them that actually it's never too late. That yes, there may be some, like with the blood pressure, lowering your blood pressure is good. There was still some residual effect from earlier, but actually you could still improve your health. So that's from a public point of view. From a doctor point of view, I think it is important because if you can, I didn't talk about prognosis and risk stratification. Obviously, it's only 30 minutes. But yeah, so at the moment, again, we are all into omics and, let's measure this. But actually, you could use people's life course exposures or trajectories to say, actually, these two people are not the same in terms of their future prognosis by using risk stratification. So I think that also enhances a clinician's ability to do a better job of managing their patients.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Yoav. Yeah. I have a follow-up question about practical implication in regard to patient education and cognitive decline. Is there something like a sensitive period in regard to timing people with, for example, Parkinson about cognitive decline? Taking in mind that we want to foster empowerment and self-management and not depression.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to the question, is there a sensitive period? Because I don't think we have the evidence one way or the other. In terms of empowerment, I would imagine, so there's two things. Does it make a difference whether, for example, if we empower patients early in the disease, in the middle period or the late disease? And I don't know. But from a practical point of view, is it easier to engage or empower patients? It may well be that actually by the time you have more advanced disease, it's very hard to engage and empower. So actually, in terms of our resources, it would be better trying to intervene early on the assumption that early might have bigger impacts. So, I mean, this is one of the classic things. So we know, just like smoking pack years, the more you smoke, the worse. The longer someone's been obese, people have done a really nice paper on what they call obese years. So if you were obese in your 20s or 30s or 40s, the longer you've been obese, the worse likely you are to have a heart attack. But more importantly, if we're going to try and reduce obesity, will our interventions be more effective if we focus on 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds, or actually focus on society, don't focus on obese people, try and change society's attitudes to food, to physical activity. So that's a second side, which is when is a period more sensitive or critical, and when will interventions be more or less effective?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sorry. No, I was just wondering about
Sorry.
behavior change, and in patients or public, it can vary much. You have to feel the burden maybe to start acting upon it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions, Katrien?
Always wanted to. So that they made me think that 2 years ago there was a beautiful paper on big data in clinical chemistry in the US showing that really large numbers, like tens and tens of thousands of people that have electrolytes measured and all kinds of measurements in their blood, some with longitudinal. It showed really beautifully that there is that everybody has his or her own curve for these measurements.
Yeah.
So cohort measurements have cohort effects, and if you take a cross section through a population, you have all kinds of noise in there. And given your remark about follow-up on policy, would you advocate to have your own weight curve, your own growth curve, your own whatever curve as a part of your personal health record, and making that available for follow-up of policy making decisions?
Yes, and I tell you why. So we published a paper. So one of the studies I'm involved in is called the Caerphilly Prospective Study, which is unfortunately they only studied men because they were looking at heart disease, but we have repeat cognitive functions. And we showed that when these men were in their 70s, if they went to their doctor who looked and did a simple screen for dementia, if they were very bad, that's bad news, they had dementia. But if they were just a little bit bad, because we had historically what was their cognitive function when they were in their 50s, it was much more informative about whether they were really declining or actually they were just fluctuating around their norm. So our argument was actually we should be measuring, and we could now do it with digitals, whatever, but ideally for some parameters, we should be measuring these in their 20s and 30s, just archiving that so that when the person becomes older, you can compare their current performance to their past, and therefore you could plot their individual trajectory. And that would be much more helpful than just saying, okay, so they scored X points out of Y today. What does that mean? So yes, I would support that idea.
So follow-up becomes way more sensitive, and you can have a smaller sample size then.
It could be. So I guess the question is, for me, if I want to look at my kidney function, if I know what my kidney function was over the last 30 years, that's much more informative than my kidney function there, unless I'm already in kidney failure, in which case I've got a problem. But my average level, if it's above, you want to know, am I just going down very slowly, in terms of EGFR, or am I going down much more rapidly, which means I'm more likely to require renal replacement therapy in the next 5-10 years. So yes, I would quite like to have that data.
Yes, me too.
Okay. Yeah, Karen Klein, head of the Department of Neurology.
Thanks very much. When I hear you talk about the issues we have and trying to delineate better the associations, reverse causation, etc., and while I'm growing older, I continue to wonder where should our efforts be spent if we really want to have an impact in society? Should we spend our efforts and energy from smart people like you on the next percentage or factor or association, or should we start researching how we can change society, how we can impact politicians? Because there we continue to have the same systems. There's a war going on here, there's a war going on there. We know that if you look at global burden of disease studies, we know exactly what the most important top 5 or 10 or whatever you want to take worldwide around the globe. And it seems that we make very, very little progress in changing any of that. Yeah. And here we are, and I love the academics of this, but if you really look at what do we need to do, what do we really need to do? And you're a smart man, so what do you advise?
I had exactly the same question. Very interesting. Because I look forward to the answer, Yoav.
Yeah. So I agree with you. We already know a lot. that if we could change would have a lot of benefit, and the barrier is politics, society, and changing things. And the other thing we know is that simply producing evidence doesn't translate into policy change. There are many other barriers. Now, I'm not a researcher on how to influence policymakers, so there are people out there who do all this knowledge transfer and policy formulation. But I have absolutely no doubt that if we could change things, like, you know, if we had the lovely cycle lanes you have here, where I live in Bristol, more people would cycle. I have absolutely no doubt. And that would have health benefits, absolutely. But I can't get the local council to spend millions of pounds building cycle lanes because they think they've got more important problems. And maybe they're right. Maybe within the bigger picture, that wouldn't be the best use of their money. But yeah, there's a different question, given the fact we know a lot. We know how to prevent a lot of diseases, particularly in, we haven't talked about low middle income countries. There, we know there's a huge amount of avoidable mortality, which if there was, you know, policy change, if there was funding, we could avoid that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can't blame the politicians because we choose them and we're responsible
Yes,
ourselves.
absolutely.
So
You're
you
right.
know, it's we all need to do this together. But how?
Okay. You're right. We choose the politicians. On the other hand, politicians, if they're really good leaders, can persuade us to do things we may not wanted to have done in the first place. Like, nobody votes for more taxation, at least in England. I don't know what they do in the Netherlands. But if you say, I'm going to tax more, you will lose. But having got into power, if you are persuasive, you may persuade the population to accept more taxation or better use of taxation.
And going on the question of Karen, you know now the Radboud University Medical Center. You've spent a lot of time here. And we want to be a knowledge institute on the field of health. I want to have significant impact on health and healthcare.
Yeah.
Have you some tops that you say, okay, that was very special that we do things like we do them here in Nijmegen, and also maybe some tips, some positive things and some negative things about you. You're a smart guy, as Karen said, okay, and you know a lot about long-term effects of determinants of health.
Yeah.
And what are we doing good? And where can we improve as Radboud University?
In the Netherlands?
Nee, the Radboud University Medical Center.
Oh, I'm not sure I know enough about Radboud University.
You spend, you know Bas, you know other people, you've spent some time here. A little bit challenging question.
I know the Parkinson's Excellence Center, which does amazing stuff, and it really brings together a wide variety of research. I mean, okay, so this is not an observation on Radboud, but I'm sure you're doing it. There's no question, and this is happening in Bristol and many universities, that the big societal questions, whether it's climate change, the aging brain, it absolutely requires people to go outside of their disciplinary silo and to work with people who they never work with, whether it's mathematicians, computer scientists, engineers. That's the way you're going to get radical new ideas. I'm sure you do it in Radboud. I don't know. In Bristol, we have, for example, we're part of the Population Health Science Institute, whose job it is to get people who don't normally talk to each other to try and come up with new ideas. So I have absolutely no doubt that is one important way forward. We all tend to work just in our little specialty, in our little niche, and we don't know what's going on next door, and the developments in other fields which are really important.
That's an excellent tip, I think. And going on that, do you think that we spend more than 1 billion of euros, more or less, to individual care? Do we spend too much efforts on individual care, or should we focus more on population-based interventions?
Yeah, so again, it won't surprise you.
Yeah, of course.
I think the balance between acute care and prevention is wrong. Again, I'm talking about England. I suspect it's true in the Netherlands. I don't know enough about the Netherlands. Now, of course, you can't, when you have someone in front of you who's acutely sick, that will always drive the priority because you're trying to help the poor person there. And you never see, if you prevent 100 people getting sick, you never see the people who don't get sick, but you see the person you do the heart operation or the high dramatic surgery, which is very expensive. But of course, if you could prevent them ever getting to end stage heart failure or whatever, you wouldn't need to do the dramatic surgery. Yeah. So I think it's a very difficult balance to strike. But I think we absolutely don't spend enough. And you couldn't do it overnight. You have to slowly shift the ratio of spending to do, ideally you have more money on spending altogether, but if the pie is finite, how much we shift from acute care to prevention, I think, has to be resplit.
And regarding prevention in the Netherlands, it's a bit a trend that we want to focus on health goals. Does that help, or is understanding what happened in life more important?
I'm not sure what health goals you have.
For instance, longer life expectancy, for instance, of less inequalities in health.
Yeah, so I think, the problem with all targets is they can have perverse incentives and they actually backfire. So most people would argue, rather than living longer, we want to compress morbidity. So it's disability-free life, or it's good quality life. Nobody wants to live another 5 years if their life is miserable because they're disabled or whatever. So it's more about the quality of life rather than longevity. But in terms of inequalities, yes, I think in England, there are large variations in health outcomes which could be preventable if society was different and people had different life opportunities. And not only is it very expensive, because those people cost a lot of money, it's a real waste of human potential. Those people, if they were healthy, would they be more economic active? They would produce more. They would contribute more to society. If you're disabled and you can't work, it's very hard to contribute. So I think it could even be cost saving in the long run, but persuading governments is not easy.
So more efforts, more goals, probably more targets, inspired by a mission. And a better understanding of what happens in life is also very important. So I think that's a very important conclusion. And also try to connect with other people from another discipline and try to get inspired and improve the health of all people in the Netherlands. Thank you very much, Yoav.
Thank you very much.
I thank you for your attendance, and Yoav, you is special for your beautiful grand round.